So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about kind of anti-immigrant bias in the relationship to identity formation, and I want to say something up top, just a few big picture points. One is it can be really hard to look at a lot of that data, and you can be feeling pretty down. What I would say is, from a historical perspective, we have been here before. And we've had struggles over immigration and American identity, migration and American identity throughout our history. We've actually often had these two parallel narratives. And so it's important to recognize that this can feel like an assault, and it is. And at the same time, I'm amazed at the resilience of human beings and particularly immigrants. And I don't want to put the burden on them, but it is a reminder of just how amazing, you're all educators, how amazing young people are. So big picture, to echo some of the statistics that Denzel threw out there. So about 26% of the kids in US classrooms, whether it's independent schools or public schools, are immigrant origin. And actually, increasingly, you're finding that number echoed in a lot of the democracies in Europe. Actually, higher percentages actually in some European school systems. Unfortunately, now I'm going to talk about the US. So unfortunately, big picture, the immigrant origin kids, and by immigrant origin, I mean immigrants and then the children of immigrants, are often marginalized because of government policies, programs, obviously intensifying prejudice. And we'll talk about where that stuff is coming from. Immigrants and non-immigrants, right? Immigrants and citizens, and regardless of people's status, we're all breathing in the same air. And so, Beverly Daniel Tatum, who studies racism, talks about how we breathe in the smog, and we are breathing in anti-immigrant messaging right now. And it affects the way the young people behave. It affects how they see themselves, how they see others. And unfortunately, this has a catastrophic effect on young people, on students, and schools, on teachers, and really the health of the democracy as a whole. So let me give you a sense of what I mean. So right before COVID broke out, a couple pieces in the Washington Post looking at bullying and how the president's language and messaging is actually starting to get used inside schools increasingly. So they were talking about, the Post reported that there were an average of 2 incidents per school week have been publicly reported since the election. Now, anti-immigrant pieces. Obviously, that's just what's getting reported, and never mind the fact that a lot of doesn't get in the papers, and a lot of these smaller incidents aren't so small, whether it's hate notes or swastikas on lockers, which again, you're seeing reports like this, not scientific studies capturing every piece, but we know this number is on the rise. And unfortunately, this isn't just coming from immigrant kids, actually. We know that increasingly, not just targeting kids, non-immigrant kids in schools. Increasingly, we're finding that educators themselves, unfortunately, are participating in this. Again, there was a Washington Post piece from that week, again, right before COVID. This was actually on my wife's birthday, and who's the child of immigrants. And it was a story about an immigrant kid who decided to protest, kind of a Black Lives Matter inspired protest, decided not to stand for the national anthem, and the teacher told her to get back to her own country. Well, what does it mean when the adults in your lives are doing that with you, right? So I was going to do this as a poll. I think I'll just do this out loud, and maybe I can just jump in the chat. So what percentage of principals in the United States do you think reported problems with anti-immigrant rhetoric in their schools? 60% of them. And again, that's probably an underreporting of what's actually happening for a couple reasons. One is that there's a demographic and a partisan breakdown. So in counties where people were majority Trump voters, there is actually from a recent poll by John Rogers at UCLA, there seems to be an underreporting of anti-immigrant incidents as a whole. People reporting that there aren't problems, yet there's a lot of self-report from those areas that there are anti-immigrant incidents happening. So we'll say 60% is reported, And we also think that that is probably an underreport. What impact is immigrant enforcement having on kids, right? So we read stories. So this is a story from last summer about the ICE raids and the kids left behind in Mississippi. What impact? Well, we know that about 85% of immigrant kids, this is a rather large study, 3,600 educators, 85% of immigrant origin kids are expressing overt fear of immigration enforcement among their students. When kids are that afraid, it is really, really hard to learn. So one thing we know also is it's not always kids worried about themselves, but they may live in families with mixed status. So how many kids live in mixed status families? I didn't do this as a poll. How many kids lived in mixed status families? 4.5 million kids live in a mixed status home. That means that that their kids may be documented, but their parents may not be. One child may be documented to have DACA status, but their brothers or sisters may not. And so about half of undocumented adults live with children under the age of 18. And about 3/4 of children with an undocumented parent are citizens. And so on top of that, there's about 1.5 million undocumented children in school. And what is life like for them? And you know these, because you know these kids, but let me just articulate it. That, can you imagine the fear of living on your own, or the fear of parental deportation? Right, and somebody saying they see several kids living with family that are not really blood relations. That's absolutely true, Jennifer. There's a real difficulty planning for the future when you worry that the adults in your lives could be taken away. It leads to a distrust of authorities, right? So if you're worried that the authority figures are possibly going to be taking the adults in your lives away, what does that mean? It really starts to complicate your sense of belonging to this country. You're a citizen, you belong, you want to fit in, right? Belonging, we know this from a psychological point of view. Belonging is an absolutely basic need. But what if you're afraid that these folks are going to go take your family away? So it leads to a distrust of authority. And it's hard, actually, to develop relationships with authorities, and yet we need them. So this isn't just a problem for immigrants, actually. I would argue that this is a problem for all of us, that I would also argue it's not a problem that was primarily made by immigrants. As for example, 25 hate crimes in schools increased by 25% in 2017, right? Who's committing those crimes? And there is unfortunately, a partisan correlation to bullying of those as perceived as immigrants. And it's higher in Trump majority communities. I'm not saying this as a partisan point of view. I'm just giving you a map of what's being reported in the data. So in Virginia, for example, that's one state, bullying incidents of folks of immigrant origin were 18% higher after the election in Trump majority counties as compared to non-Trump counties. And nationally, we're talking about a 9% higher targeting of immigrant kids, or people getting targeted because of their race and ethnicity. And it's not just affecting students. School personnel are talking about really widespread physical and mental health, and kids are reporting negative educational engagement. Of course, it makes sense, right? How are you going to engage in school when you're afraid that you just literally aren't safe? And so teachers and principals and counselors are talking about the stressful conditions that they're working under and the effects of that on them. So how are we going to give the educators, how are we going to give y'all a chance to process what's going on when we are so concerned about our kids? But this isn't just about immigrant kids, right? Who are the folks who are the perpetrators of many of those incidents? It strikes me that this is a real problem. When we're talking about bullying, this is not a healthy behavior. When we're talking about hate crimes, this is not a healthy behavior. So I am worried about immigrant origin kids. I'm worried about the folks who are leading some of the violence and bullying and taunting as well. This is troubling, and this is dangerous for our communities. And right now, the online extremist groups are trying to take advantage of what's going on with COVID. They see this as an opportunity to exploit fear, exploit some of the divisive rhetoric that's come out of by political leaders in the aftermath, in the middle of this COVID crisis. So there's a real intentional targeting of non-immigrants to join extremist groups in the middle of all of this. So even before COVID, we know that communities, this is my attempt at a joke, they turtle in, that people tend to retreat in newly diverse communities, right? This is not my term, it's Robert Putnam from Harvard University, who's studying newly diverse communities. But even more complicated, maybe a little bit more nuanced, is that with increased diversity and geographic segregation, in other words, newly diverse communities, but people aren't necessarily living and interacting with each other, but yet they're close to each other. So like one neighborhood may be getting more diverse, but you're in the neighborhood bordering it. We know that that is a really, really strong predictor for increased prejudice, right? So that, unfortunately, I mean, when you start to think about the residential patterns across the United States, and, you know, Denzel's talking about North Dakota becoming such a new destination for immigrants. These are communities that are becoming newly diverse without these same histories of immigration. So I would say that there are three biases that are shared globally about immigrants, and then we'll talk about how this starts to affect their lives. One, people overestimate the number of immigrants there are. Number two, they think immigrants are culturally and religiously more different than they are. And they think that they're in economically worse shape than they are. They think that they're less educated. And these are, you know, these are just globally shared biases, right? I can't say that all the triggers are the same as the ones that have been studied in the United States. But yes, they are globally, they're global. So how does this affect kids? So humans don't live in isolation, right? We develop our identities within a context, and that context influences the choices that we have and the opportunities that we have in our lives. So immigrant origin kids often enter schools having undergone a series of stresses or traumas, and if not, sometimes their parents have. That's particularly a big deal and acute for folks who have escaped violence, undergone a hard journey. So it's also a big deal, again, for folks in mixed status families, those concerns about what's going to happen to the adults in their lives. And this is happening, as I spoke before, in the context of a spreading increasingly visible hate movement or movements in the United States. And this hostility is making its way into schools. So when we think about kids' identities at Reimagining Migration, we do this in a way that was influenced by a psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He's one of the guys whose ideas helped found Head Start. And we remind ourselves that our identities are built in context. He talks about the ecology of identity. So maybe in the middle of this, the things that we think about, our age, our gender, our ethnicity, our nationality. But all of this stuff is mediated by the cultures and communities and the social organizations in our lives. So how is our family, our peer, our neighborhood? What are the messages there? What's going on around your neighborhood and the politics and the policies of the larger community? And then moreover, how is that layered upon by the cultural tradition and the historical patterns of a neighborhood, the historical context and the patterns of inclusion and exclusion. So when we think about our kids' identities, I think it's important not to just focus in on these things that we might think like tell us something very definitive about somebody, right? Because a kid's identity, those central points they're gonna be the same regardless of whether you're living in Brazil or Boston, but the social context will have changed. So you might think about how well do you know your kids and your kids' identities? And maybe you should spend some time thinking about how do you build a rapport and start to map and chart your own students' identities so you recognize the stresses that they're facing. Again, big picture stresses, the trauma of migration, the culture shock of learning a new world, the challenge of acquiring an academic language, but also the concerns about family and the concerns about a family trying to navigate a new culture in the middle of this broader xenophobia. So if we think, what's going on, and that's sort of what's going on in the broader society, but kids actually have some resiliencies within them that are actually going to help them navigate this stuff. There's some optimism that is very much part of the immigrant tradition and psychologists. My colleague Carola Suarez Orozco, whose work is really the backbone of everything I'm saying, will tell you that there's this long-term tradition of immigrant optimism and a work ethic that's unbelievably powerful. There's a value of education, which has often been part of the reason why people migrate in the first place. Immigrant families, despite these questions of family separation by choice or by force, communities and families tend to be more cohesive, even though they've often redefined what families are. And then immigrant kids are actually finding themselves bicultural, not necessarily by the mix in their family, but that they are able to go back and forth between non-immigrant communities and immigrant communities, right? So that's actually an amazing resiliency, and it allows some flexibility that's related to being bilingual. We actually know that there's cognitive flexibilities that come along with being bilingual that allows for great perspective taking. As educators, we need to be taking advantage of this stuff. So if you want to counter deficit thinking, here's 6 forms of kind of cultural cachet that we should start to think about. Immigrant communities are aspirational. They have hopes and dreams that we can build on. There's linguistic skills that they come. And I hear somebody saying they like third culture kid. I think it's definitely it's another way that people refer to folks. I'm always ready to listen to language as it changes. Absolutely. Thank you, Mohammed. There's familial aspirations, right, that are supported. There's these social structures in which kids navigate inside and outside of their families that help build some resiliency, right? And then students do find themselves developing skills as they navigate inside and outside of these immigrant communities. And really, there's kind of a desire for equity and fairness that kids come with them, right? A desire for justice. And so we should think about how do we take advantage of these kind of this cultural capital that they bring with them. So here are 5 things that I think that we could all be doing, and I will say them relatively quickly. 1, as educators, these are 5 steps that I think we should all, in every classroom, whether it's a museum, an after-school program, be doing. 1, we should work on building a trusting relationship with kids. We need to know all their students as people, not just as learners. Virtually, that means we're going to have to try to figure out how to take advantage of one-on-one time if we're not meeting kids directly, chatting, texting, whatever it takes to build a real relationship. Learn about the communities your kids come from. I know that is something that we'll be talking about later this afternoon. And then invite students to share their own stories, right? Number 2, really important, we need to make sure kids are safe in school. 25% of schools are reporting and a 25% rise of hate crimes in schools. So we need to identify the in and out groups in schools. We need to notice the way that students and faculty are talking about immigrants, and they're responding to people who are perceived as newcomers. And again, that's listening in the hallway and in the bathroom and in the classroom, and in the digital world, it means we need to know something about the digital habits and lives of our kids. But you also, as an educator, have to be prepared to intervene when it's necessary. And that means not just when kids are bullying, but it may mean when another one of your colleagues is involved in this. So 3, make the diversity of the community visible. And embrace, honor the diversity of languages. Think about the public addresses in schools. What languages are those things in? Embrace the identities, the cultures, the family practices of your school and community, and make them visible. There are new opportunities with remote learning, right? To find ways to productively build bridges. So work with your colleagues to think about how you might do this. Think about the rituals in your school, academic rituals, but daily routines, and how are they honoring the diversity? Display message of inclusion. You know, it's one thing to do that in the hallway of the poster. Maybe it's in the virtual world, it'll be in our PowerPoints, in the messages that we send home. Two more. One, set high expectations and new learning opportunities. We talk about kids, again, we'll get this later, but how do we build on the funds of knowledge, the knowledge and language and culture that our students bring with them in the classroom? Let them build on that. Don't ask them to erase everything they already know. That's a terrible mistake. Number two, think about building thinking routines that build some long-lasting habits like perspective taking and inquiry skills. Help students begin to recognize inequities of opportunity and give them opportunities to practice taking action to build bridges across communities. Teach about migration. Don't wait for the next nasty political debate. Give kids the knowledge ahead of time so they can start to think about it. And encourage reflection on the civic issues that are related to migration, whether it's any of the issues that Denzel brought up. And then finally, as an educator, number one, we don't know it all. We have to be prepared to learn and grow. All right, y'all? That's a lot I threw at you. So thank you so much. I hope this was useful.